Hunter, man, thanks so much for coming on the show here today. Really excited to have you on. Could you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Hunter Eisenhower. I'm currently the associate head coach for sports performance here at Arizona State, and I work with men's basketball and women's triathlon. And previous to this, I was with the Sacramento Kings, and previous to that, I moved all over the country. Me and my wife did, and now I have a 1.5-year-old and another one on the way. So me and my wife want to be a little bit more solidified and lay roots somewhere. And we both love Arizona and always wanted to live here. So ended up in Arizona, and hopefully we can be here for a really long time.
Yeah, I love it, man. I love it. So I'd like to get just a little bit of background before we get into this. I love to learn a little bit more about you. So talk to me, man. Like, what got you started in the world of physical preparation? How'd you get started working out, or what made you think about strength and conditioning maybe as a career?
Yeah, so I started this whole journey like playing basketball, and the weight room was never really that big for me growing up. As most basketball players probably talk about, like in football, it's like, oh, I love to lift. That's what I was drawn to. To me, it wasn't really that. I love basketball. I love to play basketball. And like I trained in high school, and we trained in pretty informal strength and conditioning program in college when I played. So like it wasn't really about the weight room for me.
Right.
But I knew that I loved basketball. I knew that I loved athletics and good athletes and watching good athletes. And so when I was going through kind of like my undergrad, I was thinking like, what can I do to just stay within this field? I don't want to be in some random like common job, because
Right.
I've always just said that like I want to enjoy what I do. And a lot of people are like, well, that's not what jobs are about. You just work your job and go home and enjoy the weekend. I'm like, well, I don't really want to live my life like that. Like I want to enjoy what I do. So during undergrad, I was on track to be a physical therapist, because I knew that was kind of just like a common route. It allowed me to potentially stay within sports. And I had a professor at Seattle Pacific. His name is Dale Canavan, and he was a former strength coach. And he would just kind of like, I would talk to him so much after class because I loved his biomechanics classes. I love his exercise physiology classes, and we would just talk about random topics. He's like, I can tell you're really passionate about this. Like, you should consider being a strength and conditioning coach. I was like, well, no, like I'm already like, granted, I was like a sophomore, so I had plenty of time to kind of like change paths. But I was like, no, like I'm going to be a physical therapist. And then I took a visit to Northern Arizona's physical therapy school. I flew down, met with like the director, toured campus. But when I was here, I knew that Exos was a thing. So I was like, well, I might as well just like see what this whole thing is about. So while I was here, I got a tour of the Exos facility here in Phoenix. And I remember flying home after that trip being like, I'm so much more fired up about seeing that Exos facility. Like that got me going when I was there. And like, I mean, the physical therapy school is cool, and like the conversations I had with some of the professors are cool, but like, what am I really going to be passionate about? So once I got back from that trip, I was doing an internship at a physical therapy clinic, and I was just like, this is boring. And I started interning with the Olympic staff at University of Washington. And at that point I was like, okay, my mind's kind of made up. So then from there, I worked with the football staff, worked at Seattle University, got a GA, and then the rest is history. But it was really Dr. Canavan kind of like nudging me in the right direction, and then just really cool experiences early on to kind of be like, wow, this is what strength and conditioning is, sports performance. And then, yeah, the rest is history.
I love it, man. I love it. And then last but not least, I always love to give the young coaches that are listening in like some perspective, right? Because when you're coming out of school, you're like, yo, I'm going to go get that first D1 job. I'm going to work in the league. Yeah. They want to make all those jumps, but there is levels to this, as you know, and it's a path. So I would love to hear about your path and your journey to get from, hey, man, I think I'm going to do strength and conditioning, to where you're at today.
Yeah, I think what's really cool to look back at is that every job that I was trying to get, or every job I got, like I wanted so bad that it brought me to tears when I like got the acceptance call.
Right.
And like looking back at the positions I've had, they've all grown, and like I felt like I've been moving in the right direction within my career. But like it wasn't like, I got to get this GA position at Minnesota State Mankato, so eventually I can get to the Sacramento Kings or Arizona State. It was like, I want this GA position at Minnesota. I remember like
Right.
me and my wife were engaged at the time, and I got a call about the position at Minnesota State Mankato from my former boss, Tommy Ancrot. And he's like, hey, Hunter, we want to bring you on. And I remember crying after I got the call because I was like so excited. Like, I got a graduate assistant position. So
Yeah.
all that to say that I think that you can be like very farsighted and think like, I want to end up in the NBA. Well, it's like, cherish, enjoy, appreciate the positions you get before that lead you there, because you're not going to go from unpaid intern to director in the NBA. Like, nobody has ever done that. Nobody will ever do that, nor should they. So I think it's just like understanding their steps to it and understanding how much value you can get from each step, that it's just going to help prepare you, because you don't want to get to that dream job too early.
Yeah.
If you're not prepared for that dream job and you get there and you're way over your head and you do a horrible job, you're going to get fired. And then it's like, well, dang, I just got fired from my dream job. So like,
Right.
be patient. I understand that like you need to make money. And if you're like, me and my wife got married when I was in my GA role, and like, we're like, oh, we got to start making a little bit of money, because I was making $10,000 a year. So it's like, okay, we got to start making some money too. But it's just like
Right.
appreciating the process and being able to like squeeze everything out you can out of every situation, and understanding that like, if you continue to work hard and network and like be just a lifelong learner, most of the time you'll end up in a role that you're really happy with. But if you don't squeeze everything you can out of every role you're in, regardless of the title or logo, like, you're probably going to miss out on a lot of opportunities to prepare you for that dream job.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so funny you say that, because literally I like to take down notes as you're speaking. And first thing I wrote down was being ready,
Yeah.
right? You don't want to go from unpaid intern to league, because, bro, you're not ready
Yeah.
to do that, right?
Yeah.
On every level, right? The social level, communication, the X's and O's. So yeah, make sure you kind of like enjoy the process. I know it's
Yeah.
cliche now these days, but like literally every stop that you make along the way is going to teach you something and help prepare you for that dream job when you do get there, right?
Yeah. And people talk about like glass ceilings of like, once you break into the NBA or once you break into like Division I basketball or football, whatever, but like, take your time and like appreciate getting your feet wet at lower levels where like the stakes aren't as high.
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
I'm not saying that you work in a Division II program and you're like, I'm going to do whatever I want. Who cares if an athlete gets hurt? But like, you obviously have athlete safety as like first and foremost. But I think that like the stakes are so much higher at these higher levels that like, you've got to you can have a kid, whatever, fail on a front squat when it's early on in your career and like they have 115 pounds in the bar. But like, whenever you get to the point where you're working with NBA players or these college athletes nowadays, like, you've got to be locked in, like everything's got to be sustained, tested, proven, like,
Yeah.
so there's no errors in your programming or anything. And if you jump right here, then like, you got to kind of like work out those kinks at this level, which is kind of scary to do.
Yeah. It's so funny you mentioned that too, because I was just thinking like the first time I got a real NBA player in my gym and I have Roy Hibbert come in. First off, he's 7'2", so he stands out.
Big dude.
But yeah, big dude. But my guy's making like 15 M's a year. Like, this is not the guy you want to be testing new theories out. You know, keep him healthy, get him to the regular season, make sure he's ready to go.
I think that's kind of why the NBA sometimes gets a bad rap of like, oh, those guys don't train. But it's like, they're so impressive at what they do that like a lot of them probably wouldn't have to do anything and they would still play for as many years as they did and be as explosive. And like, so yeah, you might not do like these crazy exercises for an hour and a half. You might just give them small doses and try to like move the needle in the right direction. Yeah. Because you don't need to do a lot with those guys. Like they're in the NBA, whether you work with them or not.
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, so I have so many things as I was, going back and forth with you on text and going through your IG and everything else. So tons of stuff I want to cover. Let's start really basic. How did the force system come about?
Yeah, the force system came about when I was with the Kings and I had access to force plates, and I read a book called Force by Dan Cleather. And I always say, like, when people ask, like, how did it come about? I bring up that book because it really was like the thing that got my wheels turning, about like this whole concept of force. And he talks like Dan, I've never talked to him in person, but I've read 2 of his books now, his first and second. The sprinting one is the second one. But man, I read like a page and I'm like, I need to pause and like reread that because some of those concepts are crazy.
It's dense. Yeah.
It's dense for sure. But like the most simple concept that everybody learns in their freshman level physics class is like the force equation of force equals mass times acceleration. And I just began thinking about that, and I had access to force plates for the first time. So I was like, well, like whenever we talk about being strong, we talk about producing force. And when people say I'm strong or that person's strong, they're like, oh, they can bench or squat a lot. And then I like just thought, well, if strength is force production, are we even producing a lot of force with these traditional movements? So I just did a couple experiments, trap bar deadlift, rear foot elevated split squats, like with heavy, well, for me, heavy loads.
Yeah.
And like, okay, force was 3,000 newtons, arbitrary number at that point. Cause I was like, well, I've never done this on a force plate before. That could be a shit ton, or that, I'm sorry, a crap ton, or that could be like nothing. So then I did like a drop catch where I just manipulate that force equals mass times acceleration. I reduced the mass portion, but I increased the acceleration portion, and I saw force was 1,000 newtons more. So I was like, okay, there's something here. Now that was like the high force pillar. And that's kind of like, I wrote an article on Simply Faster Redefining Strength. And like, that was all about high force. And that was kind of just like where I was going to take it. Like, hey, I think we need to think about strength in a different way. But then I was thinking like, there's other concept that I'm pulling from so many smart people and books I read and like conversations I have that I think can like fit together more holistically within a total training system, as opposed to just like redefining strength. So then it came, obviously speed development is like a huge portion of what I think is important. And regardless of sport, like I just think that speed development is the top of the spear, or the tip of the spear. So I think that like that had to fit into my program. Well, I'm like, okay, well, decelerations are higher forces than max velocity sprinting. So like maybe decels go in the high force category, but I need like a quote unquote fast force section with sprinting and oscillatory movements, which I think are very powerful. And then obviously working with basketball players, it's like, okay, their tendons take a beating, and high and fast force training potentially like adds to that beating a little bit. So like, what can I do to be more therapeutic for tendons? So that was slow force. And then finally, like talking with a lot of individuals like Trevor Harris, and Trevor's a very good private facility coach in Ohio at 440 Performance, but he is incredible with like that human force concept. I always say he's like the human force king, because it's like crawling and crouching and climbing and different variations, and just like true, in my opinion, GPP. To me is not high volume squat, hinge, pushing and pulling. Like to me, that's still pretty specific. Right. So GPP to me is human force of crawling and climbing. So it started with high force in those initial experiments. And I was just kind of going to like sit in that area. But I think there's potential here to kind of create this holistic system. And now it's how I program. It's how I view the year. It's how I view adaptation and quality. So it's kind of just ballooned into this. And to be honest with you, it's just something I was like, I want to put something together that helps me. And now I've realized that I think it can help other people as well.
Yeah. Yeah. When you came up with this concept, it kind of reminds you of like the 4 like quadrants, in like a square. What is that, a Venn diagram or whatever? It kind of reminds you of that a little bit.
And
go ahead.
One thing I will say about that is Daniel Bove. So I read his quadrant system book. And I don't know if he talks about it in that book, but somebody like, I don't know. I started talking about like high force and fast force, and somebody sent me like a picture, and he like talked about, well, high force is not like that.
Right.
People talk about high force in like different terms, but like a fast force portion of his book, I was like, oh shoot, I'm kind of like stealing this man's terms, because I didn't even realize that he like coined these. We talk about them in a little different way. And I think the way that like I break down like my fast force section is different than the way he presents that topic.
For sure.
However, like I think I'm not trying to steal anybody's stuff, and I always try to give like credit where credit is due.
Sure.
And that was just a coincidence that we ended up on those same titles. But I think like the human force section and so the slower force and like what is actually in those pillars is a lot different to create kind of like the force system as I know it.
Absolutely. Well, and I know one of his quadrants is like mechanical, right? So like low intensity, high volume. So like your bodybuilding style works. So there's definitely
there's nuance,
similarities and differences.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So how do you take that concept and then flip that around and then use that to drive programming, right? Because I think that's one of the biggest things. People love to talk about, oh, this system's cool. And then they're like, okay, but how do I actually use it?
Yeah. And that's been the question I've gotten. And I've given like 2 presentations now on it. And I try to go in depth of like a little bit more in depth of how I program it out. But I also want to give each pillar like it's respectable time, because you have to understand the pillars before you start programming it. But like,
Sure.
Whenever I think about programming, let's say like from a year, it's like there's general themes throughout. So we're going to work like general to specific. We're going to work with our speed development stuff. It's typically going to be like heavy to light, short to long. With some of our training stuff, it's going to be like some strength at length concepts from like Tim Karen early on to like some more superpower based elastic movement type stuff later on. So there's general themes that go throughout. So then I think you just fit those themes. So for me, it's like early on in an off season, like we'll go through I don't like using the term GPP because what I said earlier, but I think everybody just understands that.
People have a certain connotation of what GPP is. Yeah,
exactly. So I try to break that mold just to pretty much mention what I said before. But anyways, early off season, when we're looking at like the force system and implementing it, I want to try to get as far away from the sport as possible and just be very general. So we'll do like, let's say we have 4 training days. It'll be 2 human force days and 2 slow force days. Now within those human force days, we'll like play spike ball or play soccer or throw a football, just to like true general physical preparation, I believe. Yeah. And within those human force days, we'll still sprint. So sprinting is something, but I'm not going to bring out timing gates. They might be barefoot on a turf. They might have a chain hook to them. It's just kind of like touching speed exposures.
Yeah, sure.
But not like as dialed in as we get later. And then as I go through the summer, we'll progress into like my Kryptonite and Superpower program, which I know we'll talk about in a little bit. So I won't dig into too much of that necessarily right now, but then you begin to manipulate those 4 pillars, high, fast, slow, and human, based on the adaptations that you're trying to create. So like more muscular deficient, more elastic deficient, then you get to the superpower block, and it's like, okay, how can I manipulate those variables to like create the adaptation I want? In season, you get to the point where you're thinking, okay, I have high minute, I have maybe moderate minute, no minute or low minute or red shirt. And how can I like apply those stressors? So like high minute guys might do, or girls might do more slow force to be more therapeutic to the beating that their tendons take. Whereas some of your low minute people might have to do more fast force to continue to touch the qualities that they don't get on Thursdays and Saturdays whenever we play. So like you can manipulate all these just based on the quality you want to improve. And it's more of like a vertical integration approach as opposed to a linear approach. So people have asked me before, like, okay, so you go human for a while, move to slow, move to high, move to fast. It's like, no, it's all present. It's just like the dose at what you give based on the adaptation you're searching for.
Yeah, no, I love that. And, I've not heard the term human force, at least the way you're describing that, but I love that. There are definitely elements of that, whether it's like you said, crawling, rocking, rolling, like all those basic things. And as well as I do, like the more specialized somebody gets, the further they get away from a lot of those qualities that maybe made them more adaptable, resilient, robust, whatever term you want to use.
Yep.
So finding times and ways to integrate that back into their training, especially with these guys that have been, or girls that have been playing their sport for a while, I think there's a ton of value and merit in that. That's really cool.
Yeah, and it's really just trying to fill in like when you play a sport, let's just use basketball because that's our common language. When you play basketball, like it's a very dynamic sport, but you're going to be doing common movement patterns over and over again. Like if you really broke it down, it's like certain joint angles are going to be very common, especially like if we're talking about a guy shooting on a gun, shooting 1,000 jumpers, like that is the same movement pattern over and over and over. Yeah. And then even when you play, like very similar movement patterns, dynamic, I understand, but like very similar movement patterns on the same surface. And then when you get in the weight room, like most people think squat, hinge, push, pull, and like, okay, you can have variation with that at angles and depths, but like very similar movement patterns. So yeah, you do cover a lot in like the movement library. However, there's small cracks that like, okay, a lizard crawl might hit that you don't get from anywhere else. So now I'm moving my hip through this like certain level of internal rotation with a certain level of stress at the joint that like you're not going to get anywhere else. And I think that if we can fill in the gaps of all the other training that we do with some of this human force stuff, then like the robust nature of an athlete is going to be potentially higher. And then also you're going to enhance qualities that are just going to help you with more specific stuff later on, which to me is like the basis of GPP training.
Yeah, no, I love that. The other thing I always come back to too is you know, we're taught at an early age, oh man, and the weight room, if you can go through a full range of motion, like a fuller range of motion is better, right? But like, hey, a lunge stop in basketball looks a lot different than a lunge executed in a weight room. So like finding those times and finding those windows where we can go through that larger range of motion, distribute force, so it's not all just coming straight through somebody's knees or patellar tendon. It's like, oh man, kind of loosens things up a little bit. So then when they go back onto the court, like you said, they're not taking that same beating. So just progressively giving them a little bit more mobility and wider movement availability or variability in their system can be really powerful.
Yeah, and that's what I try to tell some guys sometimes. Like we'll do, especially like within fast force training, we'll do like what I call like every rep different movement. So it'll be like a lunge variation, but it's like every rep has to be different. And I had a guy in the other day and it was like, hey, we're going to go six each leg of every rep different lunges. And I want you to be as creative as possible. And like,
I like that.
You see the first couple reps, like they do a forward lunge, they do a lateral lunge, like they're doing all the lunge variations that they've ever done, like within a weight room. It's like, okay, we'll do lateral. Maybe we'll do like that curtsy step behind lunge. I'm like, no, like get outside of the box, like be creative, twist, like put your hands on the ground, like reach your foot as far as you can. And then you see this creativity. And I try to explain them as like, don't get me wrong. Like you want to build quote unquote strength and like explosiveness in certain patterns. But like, think about when you play, like if you're trying to get around a defender, or you're running around a screen, or you're trying to like snake a ball screen or follow a guy as he's snaking a ball screen, like you get into some weird, low random positions. Yeah. And I just want to like touch some of those positions and even explore different positions. So maybe like, now it's like this motor learning process of like, oh, my body's never been there before. I don't want to do it. But now your body's been there before. Your body has been legs crossed, twisted behind you. And do you ever get in that position in basketball? Maybe not. But if you have the opportunity where that's like the solution to the problem you're faced with, then you've touched it before. Maybe we load it with a kettlebell. Now it's been under load. I think it just gives them a little bit more confidence and like strategy within their movement library to be able to like solve problems that happen on the court.
Yeah, I love it, dude. Okay. Changing themes very slightly. Let's start broad and then we'll dive in here. Talk to me about training for superpowers.
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say is that the force system and superpowers and kryptonites aren't two separate entities. It's just like the superpower program is embedded within the force system during the off season. So to me, I mean, I guess how it started is that early on in my career, I would see like really explosive elastic athletes and traditional strength coaches would be like, oh, here come the DBs. They're so soft. They don't want to lift. Meanwhile, they just ran like 21.5 miles an hour out on the field and did 900 cuts and were probably producing more force than those strength coaches ever have in their entire life. But all that to say, it was like, yeah, those guys are soft. But then I began thinking like, well, maybe there's like a reason why they're not like drawn to the weight room in the same way that you are, the linemen are, or the linebackers are. And maybe it's just because of their structure. And I didn't necessarily understand that at the time. And I didn't necessarily put the two together of like structures, but then I started hearing people talk about like infrasternal angles. And I heard like Joel Smith talk about it. And Rick Franzblau at Clemson, he was talking about it. And I was like, okay, I think there's something here because it's kind of aligning with what I've seen early in my career. So I kind of just went down that like infrasternal angle rabbit hole. And Alex Effer, like we've had plenty of conversations with me and Alex about it. And I think that like some of these individuals that like have really figured it out have educated me enough to the point where I can like piece it together to where it can influence my programming. So now to me, like the superpower program is really just like determining the ceiling of an individual and the floor of an individual. And then making sure that we are mindful that they need to be dosed with kryptonite. Because if you don't dose anybody with kryptonite, they're going to eventually have to use those qualities and they're not going to be able to, and they're going to be screwed. They're either going to get hurt or not be good in that situation. But you also have to be mindful that like we can't just give athletes kryptonite 24/7. Like obviously if Superman gets dosed with kryptonite too much, he's going to die. So like that's what you see a lot of times is you see these elastic explosive athletes and we'll sprint. Then we're going to go in the weight room and do 8x2 on back squat at 85% for 6 weeks straight. And it's like, you're stripping so much of like that athlete's superpower. So I think it's important to realize within this program is like, there is a kryptonite piece where I am dosing these elastic athletes with like some traditional movements. And like, we're touching relatively higher intensities. But then I get away from that so they can like experience their superpower, raise their ceiling, and I feel comfortable that I've dosed them with some qualities that they're going to need that might not be their superpower. And then on the same token, like you have these muscular driven athletes, even in the game of basketball. Think of like Nikola Jokic and PJ Tucker and Al Horford. Like those dudes, you don't look and think like, wow, they're elastic, they're cheetahs, they're gazelles, but they have qualities that need to be enhanced. But they also, in situations, need to move through a shorter range of motion and be quicker off the ground. And I think that you've got to give those guys those things too. Now, too much, and you're probably going to beat up some tendons and make them feel like crap. But you still got to dose them with that, and then you move into what they're good at: bilateral stances, putting force in the ground, and being strong, and making them feel strong. Like, so it's really just the interplay of like how much dose of kryptonite do you give, and then you make sure that like you give ample time to like raise the ceiling of athletes' superpowers, because that's what they're going to rely on in their sport.
Yeah, I love it, man. First off, some great names in there. I got to give a shout out to my guy, Bill Hartman, because I know he was one of the ones that was talking about the ISA. And if you guys really want to dive into that, he's got like a whole section on just like ISA stuff. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes.
To be honest with you, Bill is probably one of, if not the best when it comes to it. But when I was digging into his stuff, it was early on, and I was like, this is like way over my head. So like, I think Bill, like alluding to like the tip of the spear comment, like he's the tip of the spear with ISA probably. For sure. Very smart. And then like the names I mentioned before all have like different ways to kind of like talk about infrasternal angle. So putting all those together, I think, is super helpful. Yeah.
I mean, you got to synthesize sometimes across multiple coaches or practitioners, and that kind of helps you formulate your thoughts. But I think the point that I like there the best, and the thing that I think gets missed in some of this, is people say, oh, well, they're an elastic creature, so you just do elastic training. And I love how you're phrasing that, because look, man, yes, that is their superpower. But if you don't give them some of the other stuff, like that's when they end up, you might maximize their performance, but now there's other stuff, there's other gaps, right, that they're going to miss, or deficits in their training and in their performance that they're going to miss out on. Same thing. Hey, man, if you got, we used to always talk about like kangaroos and gorillas, right? Everybody's got different ways, elastic or fascial dominant versus muscular dominant. Hey, man, you can have your gorillas, and hey, they can love to get after it in the weight room, but you got to dose a little bit of the speed, the plyometric, the fast action type stuff. So I love how you look at that. Now, one of the things that I thought was really cool was how you look at like the different superpowers and how they express themselves in a CMJ. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you remember this post on IG, but if you do, can you talk about how like the different types of creatures or different athletes that we're going to see might look different, or their force trace is different when they're doing like a CMJ on force plates?
Yeah. So the last thing you mentioned, I think, is like the most impactful part of that. And I think that a lot of people, like early on when I started working with force plates, I was like, well, what do the metrics say? What do the metrics say? What do the metrics say? Like, what's his peak relative braking force? What's his flight time, contraction time, if we're talking about vault, or what's his time to take off if we're talking about Hawking? And it's like, I had the individual that hired me with the Kings was Jesse Green. He's now with the Pittsburgh Penguins. And we only overlapped for, I don't know, a month, because I got hired and then he moved on to the Penguins shortly after. But during that month, he could tell that I was just like very enamored by the force plates. And he is one of the smartest individuals when it comes to like dissecting force plate data. So I got hired during the summer, so we had a decent amount of time to kind of just like sit and chat about things. And he kind of just gave me a crash course of how he views force plates and how he looks at different things. And I'm thinking metrics. And then he starts drawing up like force time curves on the board and like starts saying things like unimodal and bimodal primary. And I'm like, what is this guy talking about? But then he puts it in like a very digestible way. And that's kind of how I've come to know it, and like seen so much value in looking at the actual force time curve of these jumps, because you're probably going to see most of the time, you're going to see three, let's say, archetypes of curves. Typically when somebody performs a hands on hips counter movement jump. When you do with arm swing, it gets a little different because how those add a variable to the jump. But hands on hips counter movement jump, you're typically going to see you're going to see three curves: a unimodal curve, a bimodal primary, a bimodal secondary. People have different names for those, but that's what I call them. So unimodal curve, if you see a curve, is literally just going to be the unweighting phase is a smooth line, no double dip. There's going to be the braking phase. The line's going to probably increase vertically pretty rapidly. And there's not going to be any two bumps at the top of that curve. It's just going to be one sound bump. Then you get in the propulsive phase, so on and so forth. Now, bimodal primary, you're going to see unweighting phase. You're going to see that braking phase. And then you're going to see two bumps at the top of that curve, with the first being a little bit higher. Then bimodal secondary, you'll see the same as the bimodal primary, except on those bumps at the top during that like transition between braking, maybe force at zero or velocity at zero phase. Like you'll see the second bump being a little bit higher.
Yep.
So now with that being said, like then you begin to think, and this is kind of what that Jesse was kind of like talking to me about and what he's seen, and I completely agree with you from what I've seen, is that like that unimodal jumper is probably going to be your more elastic individual. And by elastic individual, it's just like better able to utilize the connective tissue within their body, whether that's, to me, it's like a large majority tendons. And then there's also obviously fascia and things like that come into play as well. Then you've got your bimodal primary, who's probably going to be a little bit more of your hybrid, maybe produces a little bit higher output, but some of their rate metrics might be a little bit lower. And then you've got your bimodal secondary, who is your muscular driven individual that doesn't really want to unweight very well, doesn't want to put on the brakes very well, really just wants to get the bottom of their counter movement so they can be propulsive.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like these three archetypes that show up really, really well within the force time curve of jumps. And I think that like if I were to choose between you get 100 metrics or you get force time curves with no metrics, I would probably choose force time curves with no metrics, because I think that there's so much power in seeing them. And I think there's so much power in seeing how they transition because of your training. And back to the Superpower and Kryptonite program, I think if you were to test a extremely elastic individual as an 18-year-old freshman in college, they'd probably be, let's say, very sharp unimodal curve.
Yep.
You put them through a powerlifting type program for the next 4 years and you have them jump again, they're probably a bimodal secondary. And they're probably spending a lot more time on the ground. Their braking forces probably went down because you're just overloading concentric nature of movements with traditional training, and you're transitioning things. So I think that it's important to see these force time curves, understand how they play a part, understand how you can kind of individualize training and how they can better paint the archetype picture for you when you're trying to bucket athletes.
Yeah. So when I read that, I immediately started going in and looking at all my force time curves. So that part was interesting. But man, you make such a great point here, because I've said this numerous times, like the guys that I've evowed or the guys that I've worked with that have maybe only spent 1 year in, say, a college strength and conditioning environment, there's a lot of times where if I get them young enough, I feel like, hey, we need to do some more like pure, like slow force or strength-based training. But man, a lot of the guys that I get that have spent 4 years in a Division I or Division II, whatever it is, college strength and conditioning environment, man, the max strength bucket is about as full as it needs to get, right? Like, it's crazy because you see these guys and you'll see the pictures from when they got on campus or what they look like coming out of high school, what they look like now. And I know everybody loves like the, added 30 pounds of muscle, but I always come back to like, okay, that's cool. And it makes for a great like before after photo, but like, is that guy a better basketball player? And I'm not saying they're not, but it's something I always have in the back of my mind.
Yeah, that's a whole nother discussion of pre-post pictures of basketball, because like, I don't know. I think that like, to me, if I were to see somebody and shoot, I might do this summer, my pre-post pictures are going to be of force time curves of like,
see, that'd be cool.
Now, don't get me wrong. I'm still taking pre-post pictures, and my guys hopefully do put on a little bit of muscle mass. And to be honest with you, the reason I do that is for recruiting. Because when I put up a picture of an individual that walked in, looks like they're just skin draped over bones, like, and then they have a little bit of muscle on their body, parents, athletes are like, wow, that's physical development. Coaches see that, and it creates a little bit more buy-in with them, because like that's what they think about. Like, did he get bigger? Did he get stronger?
Right.
But for me, it's like, okay, that's great. Like if a guy is 6'7" and 170 pounds, like if he wants to play in the Big 12, like you're got to put a little bit of just like mass on you, put a little armor on you. But I think that once you get to a certain point and you just begin to see these guys getting bigger and bigger, and it's like, okay, my junior to senior year transformation, and he's just going from like jacked to even more jacked. It's like, okay, well, like at one point, if like the most jacked guys were the best basketball players, like then we wouldn't see the population that we do in the NBA. Like, look at who's the most,
Right.
or like who's the best basketball players in the NBA. It's like lean, long, efficient movers, explosive movers. And now you get your like Zion Williamsons and you get your whatever. But like typically, if we were going to go down the list of the top 20 NBA players, like I think a lot of them, their picture with their shirt off is going to be not very impressive. So it's like, again, this gets back to the superpowers. If you've got an Al Horford, yeah, you might want to make him big and jacked. But if you've got a Ja Morant, like you probably don't want to make him big and jacked. And I don't know if I can necessarily talk about the story, but I won't talk about specifics. But from my experience in the NBA, there was a situation where there was an individual where it was like, he needs to be bigger. He needs to be bigger. He needs to be bigger. We need to put on muscle. He's not going to be able to play 82 in the playoffs. And it's like, okay, let's get him bigger. He got bigger and he got way worse. He said, I feel way more sluggish. I don't move as well. And there would be coaches being like, dang, what's wrong with him? He seems like he's lost a step. And it's like, well, everybody's saying that he needed to get bigger. So we took away his superpowers to add like what you thought was going to help him. It didn't. Trim back down. I'm not going to say the name, but like he's playing very, very well and playing extremely well and being robust and holding up to the nature of NBA basketball. So it's like, okay, maybe the before and after picture shouldn't be what you hang your hat on in the same way that like your 1 rep max bench press shouldn't be what you hang your hat on with basketball players.
Yeah.
It's just easy to quantify. It's easy to quantify and it makes perfect sense. And if you have a coaching staff that wants to see those things, then you got to do it because that's what is going to keep your job. They obviously sign your check, but like also I think that if you can create a system where you're like proving that you're building better basketball players and like bridging the gap of the qualities that they need on the court and like showing that you can improve those qualities and guys are telling you they feel better and guys feel like they're moving better, that to me is a lot more impactful than the before and after picture of a guy looking jacked. But again, everybody's got a boss, so you've got to kind of like tailor things.
You got to play the game.
Yeah, for sure.
You got to play the game.
I do the same thing. I'm not just talking bad about people that do that and post those pictures because like you got to play the game and there's a recruiting piece and there's just so many things to this. But I think if we're really sitting in our office, not necessarily sharing like data with other people or answering to other people, and we're like, did we build a better team this year? I'm not hanging my hat. I'm not putting before and after pictures on my wall and looking at me like, yeah, I did my job.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, it's just so interesting, right? Because there's like, okay, the athlete or public facing, you have to do that stuff, right? Because they're not looking at a forced time curve like, oh man, look at that. That's amazing. Great work, Hunter. But like us behind closed doors, we look at that and we're like, oh wow, that guy's like definitively more explosive right now. So again, there's what you can show the public and what is meaningful to us as coaches, right?
Yeah, and Henry at Alabama had a situation this year during their run in the tournament where I think Charles Barkley made a comment about like Alabama looking, I forgot the word he used, like scrawny or something. And obviously, if you're a strength coach, like you're going to hear that and take a little offense to it because part of our job is putting armor on these guys. But I just thought it was funny because like Henry's an incredible strength coach, incredible person. He's probably building some obviously he's building some good athletes. There's a lot that goes into making it to the Final Four, but like he does play a big part in that. And he's probably has incredible performance data to prove that he's built better athletes. But like as you were alluding to, the public-facing commentators that don't necessarily look under the hood and see all these metrics, they see like their arms aren't very big. Like what the heck, they're weak. Who's their strength coach? But it's like, well, there's a lot more to it, Charles.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so something you mentioned a couple times now, and I want to talk about for sure. Talk to me about the Kryptonite portion of the workout because I love the analogy, right? Like I'm a huge like comic book nerd, so I love that analogy. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, I think it just like makes sense to people's mind, like superpowers and kryptonites. And to me, it's really just going back to like dosing those individuals with what they're not good at, knowing that there's gonna be qualities that you need to touch on in sports. So, for example, like a very elastically driven individual wants to move through potentially shorter range of motion and wants to be more elastic and rely on speed and rely on freedom of movement. And if they get caught, like let's say it's Ja Morant and you just touch superpowers and you make him so incredibly elastic, but then he gets in, they've just put him in ball screens and he gets switched on to Luka Doncic 12 times during the game. And now Luka's putting 250 pounds into him and he has no ability to like screw his feet in the ground, create some like compression, internal rotation, and he just gets body to the rim every time. Well, now we're in trouble. So I'm not saying that like by training athletes with this Kryptonite program, you're going to have Ja Morant being as elastic as ever and being able to guard your boy Roy Hibbert in the post. But I think that there are qualities that we can begin to give somebody like Ja Morant to when he gets put in situations that his superpowers can't contribute to, he's able to handle those things. So for an elastic driven individual, it is going to be more traditional training. Like their kryptonite to me is like long durations of like grinding through internal rotation. And I'm not going to dose that because you're going to begin to strip their superpower. But like that guarding the post example, like you've really got to screw your feet in the ground and like create some internal rotation. And there's going to be periods where they have to rely on those things. So you've got to dose them with that and you've got to enhance that quality, but not at the detriment of their superpower. Because how many times is Ja Morant going to guard the post in a game? Twice.
Right.
Okay. He needs to be good 2 times a game. How many times is he going to, go back door and have to Euro step around a defender and contort his body and finish a layup? Like often.
Right.
So I want to enhance those qualities more so, but dose him with the qualities that he's going to need in some situations.
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a great point. And I'm with you. I know Bill does this too, but I think creating like that massive like dichotomy or the distinction between the two ends. Right. And I said, like one of the things you got like Ja versus again, Jokic. Yeah. Right. Just huge body. And most people will fit somewhere in between, right? The other thing that I like to help people understand is because some people are like, well, what do you do with a Wimby? Or right, or like I'm like, okay, but there's also like one-of-ones.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, there's just freaks out there that like if you were to measure, like if you were to take Zion Williamson through like an elastic base test and then also put him through like a very muscular driven base test, like he's going to probably excel in both those. So some of those, like when we start talking about, I know I'm talking about a lot of NBA players, but like, I feel like some of those guys just like break the mold of
that's why they can do what they do. Right.
And I think that there's also like hybrid individuals that like really, and that's why you see like LeBron and like the Jimmy Butlers and who else, like even some of the like less elastic individuals like Klay Thompson, like you see some of those guys that probably aren't at the extremes like Al Horford and De'Aaron Fox are, but like you see some of those hybrids in between of like, okay, they can rely on both. They're not the most elastic, they're not the strongest, but they can rely on both really, really well.
It's just always interesting and it makes for great discussions. And, sometimes for me, it's just like when I'm getting to know somebody, cause I'll get people in for 2 or 3 days, right? Like they're just in to work with a skill guy. Hey, I'm going to get some strength work in. And first question I'll ask is, hey man, are you a 1 foot or 2 foot jumper?
Yeah. Yeah. We had this conversation so easy. On our podcast with Tyler Ray recently. Cause I've always thought like your elastic guys are going to want to jump off 1, your muscular driven guys are going to jump off 2, and whatever Tyler says about jumping, I'm going to listen to. And I asked him that question. I was like, do you agree that is the case? And he was like, probably not 100% of the time, but I think that it's a solid evaluation tool. It probably shouldn't be the one thing you look at, but it helps paint the whole picture. But then another thing that he started talking about, which I think is brilliant, he got into like, well, look at like how they're jumping. It's like, what's their hip height when they go into a jump? Like, are they sinking? Like if it's a 2 foot approach, are they like sinking into that like loading phase and then getting off the ground? Point. Or are they like keeping a high hip height and they have very minimal degrees of flexion and then they're just springing off the ground? So it's like you can have a 2 foot jumper that's very elastic, but the strategy at which they perform that 2 foot jump is just very different.
I love that. I'll make sure I link to that. I know you had posted that. I was like, I need to check that out.
Yeah, that's a great episode. He's awesome, dude.
Good reminder for me to go back and listen to. Okay, something else that you talked about, circling back to force plates here. If we're doing this in a research setting, we know all of our cues. We want to say, hey, I want you to jump as high and fast as possible, whatever. But one of the things you talked about in one of your posts was the idea of giving different cues for different archetypes to elicit the best possible CMJ. So could you talk to me a little bit about that? Because I think that's really cool. If we're just chasing like a pure performance number, right?
Yeah. So I would say for the cueing portion of things, when they're on the plates, I give the same exact cues every single time. So if you're doing CMJ, I will always say fast and high, fast and high. And if I have an intern that's running the jumps that day, I make, it's not just like, hey, make sure you say fast and high. It's like, you cannot say anything else other than fast and high. Like that is all you can say. You're not going to say, oh, that was a high jump, or, oh, you got off the ground. It's literally just like, be a robot and say fast and high, because I don't want the data to be manipulated by the psychological effect that cueing has on individuals. And like anybody that's listening, or you yourself, can go over, like, go get on your force plates and just tell yourself, like, I'm just going to jump as high as I possibly can. Screw everything else. Just jump as high as I can. Perform your jump. And then it's like, okay, get back on the plates and say, I want to get off the ground as fast as possible. Like, I don't care how high I jump, just get off the ground as fast as possible. And you'll see, like, look at all the metrics, look at the force time curves, completely different. So now if I have somebody get on the plates and one day I say, jump as high as you can, dude, like, touch the ceiling, and they jump, and then the next day I'm like, dude, we want to be off the ground as fast as possible. Like, your data is going to be all over the place. There's no consistency in your data. So is it adaptation that's occurring, or is it just the strategy that's changing? Now, the cueing piece that I think is powerful, where you can manipulate it, is within training. So like in that, let's say the Kryptonite program for a very elastically driven individual, like, I want them to screw their feet in the ground, produce more force, have higher propulsive impulse. So the cues I'm going to give them when they're in their plyometric sections, especially once we get in the weight room in a more controlled environment, is going to be like, jump as high as you can. And I'll tell them, like, I do not care how long you're on the ground for, just jump as high as you possibly can. We might prescribe like a depth jump as opposed to a drop jump. So it's like, hey, when you drop off this box, you are going to jump as high as you possibly can. Now, on the other side of the equation, now you have your muscular driven individuals within that Kryptonite program, and they want to spend a lot of time on the ground. They want to jump as high as they can, especially from a standstill position. So now I'm going to be cueing them like, yo, get off the ground as fast as you can. I don't care how high you jump. I don't care how awkward it feels. You're just going to get off the ground as fast as you can. Now, a lot of them be like, damn, I'm like barely jumping. It's like, fine, that's fine. And you start to applaud, like, well, you got off the ground so fast. And I think that you begin to like manipulate those two things to where you begin to introduce different strategies. And what you'll see is, like, at the end of a Kryptonite program of whatever, 2, 3, 4 weeks, that individual is probably going to have a higher propulsive impulse. Their rate metrics might be down a little bit. They might go from like a unimodal to more of like a bimodal primary curve. And it's like, if you do that and you see that and you don't have the thought process of, I'm just touching kryptonites, you'd be like, dang, I'm making them worse. Like, no, I want to see a shift in those certain qualities. I want to see his propulsive impulse go up regardless of his rate metrics. I want to see his force time curve shift a little bit, because now I know I'm touching and enhancing some of those qualities that he needs. Now we transition to the Superpower program. I want to see that propulsive impulse potentially stay the same. His rate metrics get shorter. His force time curves shift back to a unimodal curve. And I think to wrap this all up, like, that's the power of the cueing. Because if I kept cues the same time throughout this entire process, I know that I can at least infer that individual is producing different force time curves and changing metrics because of the strategy that they're using, the qualities that they've enhanced, as opposed to just like the cues I'm giving them to get them there.
Yeah, I love it, man. Great stuff. Okay, so one thing I wanted to touch on here, because I love super practical pieces of info, right? Because some of this stuff, hey man, there's elements of, you can add some kryptonite into your program right now, right? Like you said, vertical integration, little doses of it here and there. That's an easy win. What other easy wins do you have for people that train basketball players? What are one or two things they could add into their program today that you feel like would make a positive impact?
And I think speed development is huge. And I think that, like, a lot of times, well, I don't want to say a lot of times, I don't want to generalize the field, but I think that sometimes people can think like, well, they're cutting so much and they're sprinting so much, they get so many accelerations on the court that, like, we don't necessarily touch it. They're never going to sprint at max velocity, so we don't need to touch that. But it's like, okay, if accelerations happen all the time, so why wouldn't we want to create better accelerators? So, like, dial in your speed work. I put a story up yesterday of, like, don't be the person that has like a novel within their weight room programming and like cliff notes of speed work. It's like, we're going to warm up and do like 2x10 on 10 yards acceleration. Then we're going to go in, we're going to do French contrast in the frontal plane. And then we're going to move in through our unilateral it's like, think about speed work, value speed work, and begin to realize that like a lot of times within basketball, your athletes are probably going to be more drawn to that type of training too. So not only do I think it's impactful, but I think you're going to get more intent and enjoyment within your sessions for your actual athletes, because they're going to want to race. They're going to want to jump. They're going to want to sprint fast and tell them you ran 20 miles an hour. A lot of them aren't necessarily going to get fired up when they, back squat heavy, like a lot of strength coaches.
Right.
So I think that speed development is a huge piece, and that fits within the fast four section of the four system. And then the second one is just, I think in the weight room, having the slow four structure of the therapeutic nature for their bodies. Like outputs are great, but these guys and girls are producing extremely high outputs on the court. So like, especially once you get in season with high-minded individuals, like if they only spend 15 minutes in the weight room, like cool. Have them hit some yielding isometrics from a global standpoint. Have them hit some yielding isometrics at the local level, and then get them out. Because I think that you're going to get a lot more buy-in with them if you're not like, well, we have an hour, so we've got to train for an hour. It's like, that's how college does it. That's what the coach wants to see. It's like, sometimes I had guys that played 38 minutes and they would come in after practice already changed. I would hit them with like a couple yielding isometrics variations, and I would tell them to leave. So I think the speed development session, when you have the opportunity to dial in your speed development, is extremely important from like the specific lens of accelerations, and then the general adaptation that you can get from max velocity sprinting. And then also like implement yielding isometrics at the global and local level, because tendons take a beating, and I think it can be very helpful to create some robustness and hopefully heal some damaged collagen that's present in the tendon. Yeah.
I will just say this. The older you get, the more I think you need to remember what it was like to play sports at any level, right? Because think about, and again, I don't know how old you are, but I know I'm probably quite a bit older than you. So I know when I was coming up, right, we weren't lifting after a game, right? So, and I know high-minute games. I know how my body felt afterward. So now just imagine going and having to go through, like, if somebody gave you a full hour workout after the fact,
screw that.
You'd feel awful.
I mean, I still play pickup. Like, I played a lot more pickup when I was with the Kings, just because the staff was bigger and there was more opportunity to do so. And I would we'd get done for the day, play a game of pickup, or like play an, 30 to an hour long pickup session. And I would get back in the weight room and I'd have the lift that I had planned to do. And if I wouldn't have played, I'd been like, oh, let's cruise through this. And I'd get back in the weight room and I'd be like, okay, this hurts. I'm gassed. I don't want to do this. And it's not necessarily me being lazy. Like, to a certain extent, it was me being lazy. And nobody's holding a gun to my head and telling me I have to do the workout. But it's also just like, okay, put yourself in the body of the athlete from like
that's exactly, yes.
From everything we've talked about, from like an archetype perspective, but also from just like the demands that they go on the court. Like when we get to the preseason period and we're having 2-3 hour practices, like you think they want to come in and do an hour lift after that with 18 different exercises and work up to 90% on like, heck no, nor should they.
Yeah.
So it's like putting yourself in the body of the athlete. And I think that like continuing to play sports as a strength coach and trying to train for and with those sports is extremely impactful. And if you work in basketball and you suck at basketball and can't even like play basketball, well, whatever, go play whatever.
The YMCA, man.
Yeah, just like go play and see what it feels like, because I think that you'll realize like, damn, this workout I prescribed after 2.5 hour practice might be crazy. And now the last thing I'll say is that a lot of people will be like, well, if that high minute guy that only came in and did 2 sets of a split squat ISO and then you loaded his Achilles and patellar tendon and then you told him to leave, he was only in there for 10 minutes. Like, are you even doing anything? It's like, you can do more with less a lot of times. And I think that's what I realized in the NBA is like, yeah, they might not be in there for an hour. And in college you get 4 hours a week in the off season, but like you don't necessarily need to use all those hours, especially once you get to that in season period.
Yeah. I love it, man. Okay. Big question time. If you could alter the space-time continuum and give young Hunter Eisenhower one piece of advice, what would it be?
I will say this is kind of surreal because I've listened to your podcast quite a bit and I've always heard this question. So being asked it is kind of cool, but one piece of advice, man, I would probably, the thing I said early on about like truly valuing every experience regardless of prestige. I felt like I did a decent job of, but I think that like I was so focused on like, what's next? What's that next position? Oh, this position's available. I'm going to try to get this one, that like part of me was like 1 foot in, 1 foot out a little bit.
Yeah.
And then the second piece I would say is now that I have a daughter with another one on the way and a wife, like I don't want to get to year 30 of my career and look back and be like, damn, I missed out on so much time with my wife and family because I was like in my office programming and like thinking about the best set and rep scheme. Cause like now it's tough. Like this job demands a lot of your time. And I'm not saying that you just like ditch your responsibilities, but it's just being mindful. Like I need to do such a better job of like, when I'm home. Like I need to do a better job of like putting my phone away and not being present on social media. And like, I'll be honest with you, I'm not good at it. Like I get texts from people and I want to respond to them. And it's like, man, that could wait till 7 p.m. till my daughter goes to bed. So like just a constant reminder of myself of like, when I'm home. And I don't want to look back in 30 years and be like, damn, I missed out on so much time in my kid's life, because I think that a lot of coaches get to the end of their career and that's probably their regret.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think probably everybody listening to this can relate to that at some level, right? Like we're all achievers or overachievers. We love our job. We're passionate about it. But yeah, I also find that when I'm like locked in per se, right, and I'm always like responding and all that, like I'm inherently less happy. Yeah. Versus, hey man, put it on do not disturb for the 4-hour window between, you know, your day is over and your kids are in bed. Infinitely more happy when you do that.
And I think that like at this point in my life, it's a fun challenge to try to like be as good as I can in every part of my life. Like early on in my career, like my wife was working, I was working, like she wasn't at home. Like I could just lock in and be at my desk and be working, and I wanted to be the best strength coach possible. And don't get me wrong, like I wanted to be a good husband, and a great husband, but I was able to just like easily do those things because it was like coach, husband, coach, husband. Yeah. Now it's like dad, husband, like coach. There's the other stuff I'm trying to do with like move the needle. So it's like I just want to be as good as possible in all those areas, with the priority being like my wife, my daughter, my faith, those things, and then let like the other pieces file in line and make sure that my priorities are right. And that's not always easy to do, because when you're passionate about what you do, like it's easy to let that jump up a little bit, but it's just like the constant reminder that those three things, like faith and family, and faith being a good husband and good dad, is of the most importance.
Yeah, I love it, man. Okay, last but not least, lightning round. So 4 fairly short questions. Your answer can be as long or short as you like. Number 1, we talked about this off camera, but I got to hear it from you right now. How hot is it in Arizona today?
Ooh, right now, I actually haven't been outside in a minute. It was 110 right now. Actually, it was in Tempe right now. It's only 92 degrees, so it is actually kind of cold. I probably have to put a jacket on when I go outside.
That is crazy, dude. Yeah, it's like 90 here, so I knew it had to be hot there. Yeah. Number 2, talk to me about dad life, dude. You said 1.5, one on the way. How is that reshaped how you look at life?
I'm going to keep this brief because I don't know why, but anytime I start talking about my daughter, I start to get like literally emotional. Like I give presentations. I know that feeling. I gave a presentation at the Final Four, and I put a picture of my wife and daughter up on the last slide, and I flipped to it, and it was just going to be like a thank you to my family for allowing me to like pursue this. And I'm like standing in the room in front of however many people were there, and I like look at the picture, and I just get that feeling in my throat, like I'm going to get emotional. I'm like, oh shoot, like what the heck? But no, it's keeping it light, man. It's been so incredibly fun. It's been challenging, but I think that like moving into this stage of life has just been like so incredible. And my mom would tell me before she was born, like, you won't believe how you can love something so much. And I was like, yeah, I mean, I love my wife. I love my family. Like, and then now like this bond that I've grown with my daughter is just like, it's crazy.
It's awesome, man. Yeah. It's like, you can't describe it. You can't replace it. Like,
and now I got another one on the way, and it's another little girl. So I'm screwed.
Oh man. Yeah. 2 girls, man. You're gonna have your hands full, dude.
When we did the gender reveal for Elsie, my first, me and my wife Leah were both dead set on having a boy. Like, it's going to be a boy. We want a boy. And then pink confetti flew, and we were like, for like 3 days, I was like pretty distraught. And now I'm like, honestly, I think I would be fine with like 3 girls. Like, I love being a girl dad. I like just love having daughters or a daughter. So yeah, it's been amazing.
Yeah, for some reason I always thought my first one would be a boy, and so to have
I think every guy does.
Oh, whoa, okay,
Yeah,
and but then like you said, the bond, the relationship, it's like the coolest thing ever.
I'm nervous for those teenage years, so hopefully I can rely on my wife that obviously went through that as a female, so she can kind of help me with that process, because that's going to be a whole nother thing. And the world we live in is a scary place. So like, that's a whole nother thing. And like, I don't know, there's things that I'm nervous about and anxious about, but in the current moment that she's 1.5 and walking and saying dada and giving me kisses.
It's so far down the line, dude. And that's, look, not going on a full diatribe about parenting, but it's like anything else, right? You're ready for it by that time, because you have 13 years of experience. It's like, you don't go from unpaid intern to NBA director, right? You don't go from newborn to 13-year-old.
Yeah, that's a great point.
There's a build up to it, so you're ready for it. You'll be ready, dude.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Okay. Number 3, any cool Exerfly and Hawken experiments lately? I love that. You had a couple posts maybe on IG. Have you done anything fun with that lately? Yeah,
so Exerfly is a pretty cool piece of technology. And I've enjoyed getting out of the the squat, hinge, push, pull, and implementing some of those, like what Danny Foley and Matt Aldred have coined as like fascial based training. And I've pretty much boiled it down to is like, get your athletes barefoot, challenge their balance, total body integration, move in different ranges of motion, and add rotation to those movements. And I think the Exerfly is just like a really cool thing to do that. So I put up a post up a couple of weeks ago, and it was just like random movements. It was like a step up to an overhead press. It was like a lateral lunge into a row. And I think that just like experimenting with those type movements is really cool. And that kind of fits really well into like the elastic deficient or elastic superpower, because a lot of those guys like want to move in different directions. And if you're a muscular driven mover, like you want to just be able to like single arm dumbbell bench and have everything else planted, but it's like, no, let's get our whole body integration. So I think Exerfly is great with that. I'm scared to use the motor just because I've used the motor myself and overload the eccentric portion, and that gets a little scary. So I haven't done that like a split squat variation with athletes, but I've done that myself, which the motor is obviously their selling point, I think. And it's really cool. From the force plate perspective, to be honest with you, like there's nothing really like new that I'm doing. I think that the most new thought that I've had with those is just like, drops are great for producing high force, and I've said that they're like the king of producing high force, but I think that like introducing the ends of the spectrum of strategies in which you can land is important for athletes. So it's like you want them to be able to drop off a 42-inch box and create 3,000 newtons of force, and then you want them to be able to drop off that same box and produce 12,000 newtons of force. And it's like, are you able to manipulate force and dissipate force? I don't believe in the verbiage absorb force, but for everybody that uses it, that's kind of what I'm alluding to.
Right.
So it's just like the ability to manipulate force, and Andrew Paul and Just Fly was talking about like impulse, and I was just thinking about like force manipulation and impulse control. And like there's going to be times in a game where you're going to need to like yield through a larger range of motion, and you're not going to be able to have high peak forces because you're going to be in a weird angle that if your body experienced high peak forces to that angle, like you're probably going to screw something up. But then there's also going to be times where you're going to need to be rigid, whether you need to get off the ground again or you need to change direction quickly after that landing. So I think that having the ability to not only touch high peak forces off of those blocks, but then also like the ability to yield and manage those forces if you need to is pretty powerful.
Yes. Yeah, man, I will tell you too, I'm sure you probably experience this, but a lot of my guys that aren't your more elastic driven guys, your fascial guys, whatever we want to describe them as much as those guys don't love the weight room, one thing I have found, they really like the Exerfly. Like just kind of the freedom of movement they get from that. So they would much rather squat with some heavy flywheel resistance versus just, hey, let's load up this safety bar and get after it, boss, you know?
Yeah, you know what? I feel like because the Exerfly has like an innate rhythm that you have to use it. And I think that like with traditional movements, there's no rhythm needed. There's no like necessarily, there's coordination. Like now there's coordination needed, but like let's just compare like a pit shark to like an extra fly squat. Like in a
Yep.
pit shark, you don't have to have rhythm. You can like
No,
control the
just
tempo
get
on
on
the
it.
way down. You can like produce a lot of force on the way up. You can pause. With the extra fly, like there's an innate rhythm and coordination that you've got to have timing of like, sometimes I tell the guy like watch the cord coil, and like once you get to the top, you don't want to keep pulling because it's going to feel janky. You're going to get jerked. Like you've got to drop when it begins to drop. So I think that like innate rhythm and coordination is typically, from what I've seen, just more innate in those more elastically driven individuals. So they can kind of just like bounce and move and have freedom and go to a beat of a song or whatever it may be. Whereas your more muscular driven individuals like are more robotic and don't want to move with rhythm. So like that rhythm, I think, kind of screws them up a little bit.
That's interesting. I like that. Okay. Last but not least, number 4, what's next for Hunter Eisenhower? What are you working on? What are you excited about? Anything?
Well, I got a baby due in August, so that's going to be next for sure. Me and my wife are preparing for that. But I think from like a professional lens, I have loved where the force system has went, not only just through social media and the things I've been able to present, but like the way it's been like constructed in my mind, and all these opportunities to do like podcasts like this to present has allowed me to just like refine that system so well to now when I just got done programming for the summer, I feel so good about my summer program because of all the refinement that it's taken over the summer of like talking to people about it. So I think for me, it's now like a big project that I'm working on that like I will be rolling out hopefully by the end of the year, but it's going to be like quite a bit of stuff, is going to be like a force system mentorship. So I have like the Train Heroic program, and I've written articles, but that only obviously can go so deep into the intricacies of the system. So yeah, it's going to be a couple week, probably 6 to 8 week force system mentorship. And it's going to be everything that I've thought about, everything that I do into one course. And cool. Along with the course, it's going to be like the mentorship piece to where we'll meet once a week and talk about the concepts weekly and ask Q&As. And I'll talk about how I'm changing things potentially from when I release the course and things like that. So that'll hopefully be by the end of the year, and it'll just be a deep dive into the force system. And then obviously the superpowers and stuff will be included in that. So I'm excited about that. It's going to be a lot of work, but it'll be cool to have something tangible for the system that is all of my thoughts into one place.
Yeah. My God, you got a busy year ahead of you.
I do. Yeah, I know. I've started
a lot going on.
I've started I used to just wake up when my daughter wakes up and go get her out of her crib. And now I set my alarm for 2 hours before I know she's going to wake up and just start.
Got to.
Yeah, that's been a game changer. So I think that that's why I say hopefully by the end of the year, because who knows? And I want to put a lot of time and effort into this project. So I don't want to just put some out by the end of the year because I said that. So maybe early 2025, but
absolutely.
It's going to be a lot of work, and I'm just going to chip away at it little by little when I get opportunities. So yeah, I'm very excited about that.
I love it, man. Well, Hunter, this has been awesome catching up with you. Yeah. Love the system. Love all the great stuff that you're doing. Where can my listeners find out more about you and all of your work?
Yeah, I would say the best place is going to be on Instagram. My handle is at @HunterEyes_SP. So eyes is EIS, like my last name. Post a little bit on Twitter, but not as much. And then honestly, the best way to get in contact with me is my DMs. I'll respond to every DM I get, 'cause early in my career, I'd hate when I'd reach out to people and they'd ghost me. So now I've made the pact with myself to I don't care who you are, what you say, unless you're trying to I don't know. I don't like when people try to sell me things. Sometimes I don't respond to those people, but yeah, if you want to reach out on there, I'll respond to you. That's the best way to get in contact with me. And I post a lot of information on there. So
I love it, man. Yeah. I'll make sure I get links in the show notes. So if you want to go and follow Hunter, I would highly recommend it. He's always got good stuff and makes you think with his IG feed. So Hunter, again, my guy, thanks so much for coming on the show, brother. I appreciate it.
No, thank you. I really appreciate you having me on. Like I said, I've listened to this for so long, so it's pretty surreal to be on the podcast, but I'm glad we were able to make it happen.
Absolutely, man.
Sweet.